Hello, everybody. I hope that after our talk yesterday about children's art that you won't make the mistake that so many people do when they see a painting such as this one by Picasso and think that perhaps he's incompetent, doesn't know how to draw, or think there's something which is nearly as wrong, that he's just expressing himself. I so often hear people say that. They have learned that phrase, and they assume that if something looks the way it doesn't look to them, that this artist is expressing himself, as if he really saw it this way or felt this way about it, and therefore had to paint it in this manner. I don't believe that that is actually true from all the artists I've known and from my complete experience in looking at works of art. I don't believe that it is that, but it's something else that he's trying to express, not himself. And one of the things certainly is that quality of intensity and of belief that we discover in children's art. And it is an idea that some way by imitating the very clumsiness or the lack of skill looking at something, that he's going to be able to get the same effect. This isn't always successful, I'll tell you that, and you probably know it, that sometimes it has the effect rather that we get if somebody who's grown up talks baby talk to us, which is not really very charming, or only charms a very few people. And quite often the artist, in trying to capture some of the things which a child captures readily and isn't even trying to capture, but inevitably puts down with the firmness of his conviction, trying to get those things by, in a way, second hand, isn't always successful. And yet the artist can't resist doing it, because it seems to him so evident that what the child has, he wants. And so he tries to get it by perhaps looking at the outside. I hope that you'll look, for instance, at this tree and remember the trees that we saw yesterday drawn by children. This is a painting by Matisse. And look how many of the things that it constitutes have been taken almost directly from children's work. The large, bold pattern that is in a way a little bit clumsy, a little bit unrefined. And then this ideograph of the tree, this particular convention of making a balloon, a slightly irregular balloon, and putting a stick under it and calling it a tree. That was taken almost certainly directly from looking at children's work. And as I said, that is something that happened in the history of art around the beginning of our century. It happened, I think you'd be interested to know, at about the same time that psychology turned to the examination of children. That is about the same time that Freud began to publish his papers. And it was a period of new interest, of searching for new explanations. And art turns to children as a source of learning in very much the same way that other disciplines turn to children. And there's another thing which burst upon the world at the beginning of our century, which was extremely important to art. And I think that we should consider it because, in a way, if we look at these things that the artists looked at the beginning of the century, then we can look at their work, because they looked at things with the idea of incorporating some of these qualities into their work. And it was that search for intensity and search for a kind of sincerity, even bluntness, that made them turn first to children and then to the work of primitive sculptors. Now, I have here this morning to show you a number of examples of primitive sculpture which I have had the fortune to be able to bring you, borrowed from the Altman galleries, where there's one of the best collections of African sculpture in the West here. And these are original works, that is, these are actually African works, though there are a great many that you see nowadays which are only facsimiles or copies of them. And I brought you this one to show you the kind of thing which really flashed across the artistic world. There's still very much argument about who it was that first discovered these things as objects of art. And no one has quite decided which was the artist who first saw them as beautiful objects, as works of art. But this is the kind of thing which they began to discover around 1900 and around 1905, that had the deepest imaginable influence on the artists of that time and on artists of succeeding periods. Now, you see, of course, right away that this isn't beautiful in the ordinary sense. And this was one of the reasons that the artists turned toward it. Because, in a way, they were sick of beauty. They were sick of the kind of beauty that they knew or that they were familiar with. And they wanted to turn to something which was, in a way, a new world. And this seemed to be almost made to order for them, because it has in a quality of strictness of form, of extreme conventions of form. It has the nearly geometric use of form in such things as these patterns of the head and face, and you see, and across here, the combination of patterns which were actually thought of as pure ornamentation by the people who first collected these things. One of the things that was so fascinating to artists at this time was the concept of the neck as a column, you see. Not the neck as the kind of thing which we see and know as having all kinds of different shapes and directions in it, but the very stability, the feeling that you're getting at something which is beyond appearance, which is within the feeling of the neck as an outward expression of the inward vertebra, that they support and sustain the head, and that they are really like columns, like architectural members. And you see how much like really like a piece of architecture this kind of thing becomes. Now, there was at the beginning a great deal of misunderstanding about what these African things were meant to be or were like. You see, when you come across, if you are, as the artists at that time were, if you're trying to find a new expression in art, not a self-expression, you see, but something which is belongs to what you feel to be the new 20th century world, you will not, when you first see this, you will not your eyes won't be exhausted as they were by the time you started looking at old classical works and so on. You will see this as a daring new and in a way almost a mechanical conception of the figure and of the face. Now, if you look at that for a moment, you see how in many ways it answers to some of the problems which the artist was trying to work out, the problems of the nature of the inner structure of form. And you see how much you feel of this in terms of the bones beneath, exactly as in that neck you felt bones beneath. And the artists, when they first saw these, were immensely excited and felt that here was a kind of companion expression. And they would see such a thing as this, these are all African masks, and say, look at this stylization of the eyebrows, you see, what a handsome thing. And look at this use of little tiny holes with this larger thing. Well, what they did was forget entirely that these things were made, and the reason that they liked these things was because they were made not really as objects of art, not something to look at and admire from a distance, but because they were made with a very special purpose, which was the purpose of magic or of religion. And these which they see as stylized eyebrows were actually the ram's horns that had to do with the special ceremony that this mask was made for, because these were made to be used as masks. And you think it's very becoming? It certainly changes one. And instead of being used to ornament something, which of course now they are used for very widely, it was made from the intensity of belief of these peoples and had to do with their deepest convictions about the nature of power and the nature of the supernatural. And what turned out to be not ornamentations in terms of these little holes, but actually a part of the decoration of the thing, was because you have here one with his whiskers attached, you see. Those holes were really used to attach something to the face, to make it what? To make it more perhaps terrifying. And these were meant to be terrifying. And even now, I think that some of that quality of terror comes through. Not much. But imagine how differently you would feel about them if you saw them in the flickering firelight, and it was completely dark and night around you, and these things loomed up in dancing figures and were perhaps chanting mysterious chants, which would be known perhaps only to them. And your life depended on these masks. Then you see how differently you would feel. I'll show you one which is another type of mask, and which I think you can see had a very strong immediate aesthetic influence on artists of that time. And here you have the kind of breaking up of the face, that is the the deliberate avoidance of the qualities of the smoothness or roundness of the face, and certainly an effort to cast this in something which is like cubism, isn't it? It's like the kind of breakup of form and the effort to make a reintegration of form that occurs around 1910. Here you can see the whole mask, you see, and maybe it'll give you some feeling of the greater impressiveness. They very often had an elaborate high headdress to make the person much taller and much more exciting, or much more, well, more as though he belonged to the gods and not simply to men. And some of that quality, again, that quality of sacredness, is distilled in these things. And this was the thing which the artist aimed for. This was the thing which he recognized and treasured, and knew to be, in a way, much more valuable, much more precious than the appearances of beauty or ingratiation at the surface. Again, the artist tended to try to become an imitator of these qualities, and he could not. As we cannot return to the primitive. We cannot become again people dancing around a campfire. But we can love, I think, and admire the quality of belief, the quality of sacredness, which these things have. I'll see you next time.